Let us unite in the spirit of meditation and prayer. God of all, you are the source of life and blessings. In the holy quiet of this hour, let us all feel blessed on this occasion of the Spirit, to share our memories and hopes, to heal our wounds, to rejoice in the meaning of our common existence. Blessed be this threshold place of transition between inside and out. Blessed be the transformation when spirits of hope and change gather. Blessed be the shifting of emotions and letting go of hurts and pain as we weave the threads of our lives together in our capacity to celebrate life. Spirit of life, make us aware of our similarities and not our differences. Blessed be this community. Amen. An important distinction exists between spirituality in religion and spirituality as opposed to religion. And it has been my experience that many individuals are reluctant to use the word religion in reference to their connections to a higher power. In recent years, spirituality in religion has often carried the connection of a believer having a faith that is more personal, less dogmatic, and more open to new ideas and more pluralistic than the doctrinal faiths of established religions. I think that fear of using the word religion may be due in part to the hijacking, if you will, and distortion of some basic principles and their application by religious fanatics. Until recent centuries, the history of spirituality has remained bound up within the history of religion. Spiritual innovators who operated within the context of a religious tradition became either marginalized or suppressed as heretics. And here we are. Our own Ralph Waldo Emerson is hailed as a pioneer in the notion of spirituality as a distinct field. The Oversoul is an example of his non-traditional ideas about soul and God. The philosopher William Irvin Thompson believes that in civilized society, religion manifested in the form of spirituality. There was a time in my life when I wasn't connected to or involved in a church community, but I felt I had a very active, satisfying spiritual life. I had no congregational affiliation, so my spirituality was personal and private. It consisted mostly of reading books by people like Eric Butterworth, Shakti Gawain, and Deepak Chopra. And at that time, had anyone asked, I would have said that my deepest, most moving spiritual experiences emanated from two sources, music and nature. The experiences that stirred me the most were those of getting lost in a great classical musical score and being in the place that I felt most closely connected to the divine, outside, in the park, or walking a stretch of sandy beach, along the ocean at sunrise or sunset. But I came to realize and recognize that spirituality is complex because it combines an emotional feeling quality with both an abstract and a cognitive content. So that when we speak of the emotional quality, we can legitimately say, I feel spiritual when I feel connected to the universe with love and compassion. And when speaking of the abstract cognitive content, we can also say spirituality is about values, meaning, and purpose. Moreover, when speaking of the concrete metaphysical content, we can also say spirituality is about discerning. It's about discerning the true nature of reality. Consequently, I began to realize that the spiritual life that I had was not as complete or as whole as I believed it to be. Within these aspects of spirituality, there is an overlap of the emotional quality with the aesthetic experience of standing before a sunset or listening to an orchestra. However, there is no overlap between aesthetic enjoyment and the cognitive aspect of spirituality. And though I was certain that I didn't believe in my old Catholic school teaching with the visual of a God as a bearded old man in the sky, I wasn't quite sure about what I did believe, because I had failed to ask the important spiritual questions about meaning, values, purpose. and deep nature of reality. I have often heard people who are part of communities of faith say that they feel more inspired at the symphony or during a walk in the woods or working in the garden than being inside of a church building, because it actually is a building and the people make up the church itself. Now, to reframe what I hear them expressing is that the beauty of human creativity and the world, the aesthetic experience of art and nature, provides more sustenance to their spiritual selves than the intentional spiritual work of the church. However, they mean spiritual in the same exact way. But what I question is whether experiencing art and nature can really be a substitute for spiritual work. Although the similarities between the two kinds of experiences are close enough so that they can be confused, and each provides some of the same benefits. But there are also distinct differences between the two. The reason symphony concerts and hikes in nature are credited as spiritual experiences are because, in some sense, they are spiritual, and also because we don't have a good definition of what spirituality actually means. Some sources inform that spirituality may involve perceiving life as higher, more complex, or more integrated with one's worldview of, as contrasted with the merely sensual. Also, there are some very important aspects of spirituality not included in the aesthetic experience of enjoying nature or art. To be inspired means to draw in the breath of life and to be filled with the Spirit. Now, some Native American traditions define spirituality as that which pertains to the self or soul. Some New Agers, which is a category that I'm sometimes placed in, tend to regard spirituality not as religion per se, but as the active and vital connection to a force, spirit, or sense of the deep self. Aesthetically, a sunset can thrill us because it's beautiful. And appealing beauty is a glorious thing. It is also possible to have a simultaneous spiritual feeling with the aesthetic experience. And though they might occur at the same time and are prompted by the same circumstances, the aesthetic and the spiritual are two very different things. Just take the case of a sunset. Looking at the sun and the water, the vastness of the space involved, coupled with parts of nature working in sync to create such astounding beauty, could quickly add to the aesthetic enjoyment of the scene, as well as the spiritual sense of connection to the universe. Because the emotional quality of spirituality is the feeling that we are part of, a vast interdependent web connected to all that exists, just as we know, if you've read Ralph Waldo Emerson's Oversoul, tells us that we're a part and particle of the whole. It gives us the feeling that we have a place in the system and that we're called to do something that helps the universe achieve its goals. I believe that it is this feeling of connection, care, and call that the mystical experience is comprised of. This is the indescribable feeling that I and some of my colleagues struggle to express when we're asked how we discerned our call to ministry. However the feeling comes upon us, all of us from time to time, because the mystical experience reflects a truth of reality that is felt in many different circumstances. It's like that mountain with the answer always being no. Sometimes no, sometimes yes, sometimes I don't know. But I think that the feeling comes regularly and more profoundly to those who take time for a spiritual practice and who cultivate their minds to receive through daily meditation or prayer. The interdependent nature of existence and the feeling of mysticism explains why the feeling is as likely to come over us while walking in the woods as it is while meditating in a sanctuary. Moreover, the spiritual feeling that we sometimes get while admiring a sunset is just as real and mystic as an experience as the spiritual feeling that we invoke during meditation. But what's important to distinguish is that our admiration of a sunset for its beauty is not of itself spiritual, but an aesthetic pleasure. It's only when the sunset inspires the mystical experience of connection, care, and call in us that spirituality is added to that aesthetic pleasure. Now I find that out of all art forms, music more than any other inspires a spiritual reaction, because the content of a painting or the poem usually gets in the way. But the fact that music is entirely abstract provides the space that allows our minds to move into the mystical experience. That's why I always feel it's so important to have silence after our meditation or our prayer, because it gives you that space to allow your mind to receive it and to experience it. When we listen to a Mozart symphony, we admire the composer's genius while listening and really hearing how the various parts work together. Maybe we only admire the beauty and Mozart's skill while enjoying the music or on an aesthetic basis. Or perhaps we begin to think of the intricacy of the variations, moving lines of music as a metaphor for the workings of the universe and the place that we have in it, in various ways in which we each add to the larger creation. And at this point, we may add the spiritual satisfaction of feeling connected, cared for, and called to contribute to our aesthetic pleasure. But sunsets and symphonies don't of themselves address the cognitive content of spirituality, because the sunset doesn't ask questions about meaning, values, or purpose, and we're not expected to answer. Moreover, a symphony doesn't offer theories about the nature of reality. To have a spiritual feeling while experiencing natural or human-created beauty adds to the aesthetic experience, but our spirituality, our spiritual thoughts usually get in the way of experiencing the beauty. And this is the risk that's faced when claiming a Sunday morning hike or a Friday evening concert is religion. One may be having an aesthetic experience and a spiritual feeling, which is a good thing, but it is still not the entirety of spirituality. Even if the walk or music inspires an individual to contemplate the spiritual questions, there's nothing in the walk or the music that actually asks the questions or provides resources for discovering potential answers. Without the context of worship services that pushes and challenges spiritual growth, the individual's spiritual exploration risks remaining unfocused and unproductive. Now, while I will agree that it's possible to be spiritual outside of worshiping communities, I also contend that it's very difficult to do. Because it's easy to deceive ourselves by mistaking the spiritual feeling of connection, care, and call as the whole of spirituality, while never seeking answers to the spiritual questions of meaning, value, purpose, and the nature of reality. When the extent of my spiritual life consisted solely of listening to classical music and conversations with friends, I had the spiritual feeling regularly. But what I didn't have was a consistent and constructive worldview that put spiritual feeling within a context for my living, my life. The music of Debussy and Massenet could make me feel soothed and inspired, but it couldn't tell me what to do with my life. And though I thought that I could do that on my own, I really didn't. Not until I found a church home and a community of faith that I connected with. Now, I still find most of my inspiration comes from walking in the woods, being with nature and the environment, because pantheism is the basis of my personal theology. I believe that we should enjoy the natural and human-made beauty that surrounds us and allow the aesthetic bliss of great art to inspire and move us where it will. But it's also important to find time in our lives to ask the spiritual questions that art can only point us toward, but doesn't ask directly. So let us continue asking until we find the answers that help create a stronger faith life. From my heart to yours, may it be so. Please join me in singing hymn number 95 in your great hymnal, There Is More Love Somewhere. Because of those who came before, we are. In spite of their failings, we believe. Because of and in spite of the horizons of their visions, we too dream. Let us go remembering to praise, to live in the moment, to love mightily, and to bow to the mystery.